This is Duke University.
Thank you, Bill. I will tell you how I'm going to spend my birthday. I'm going to testify before Senator Bingaman in the morning in the Energy Committee and before Congressman Hastings, Chairman Hastings, in the Natural Resources Committee in the House in the afternoon. And I got this very nice note from my wife when I told her I wasn't going to be home for my birthday. And she said, "I think it's really marvelous that you're going to spend the day that way." And you know, most people, you would ask, is there an edge there? And she had parentheses, "I actually really mean this." So much for my birthday. You've been a marvelous dean here, and the relationship between you and Tim and the school and the institute I will comment on. I think it's a very productive one for both institutions. I think it has attracted enormous amount of attention and credibility for the portfolios that both of you carry, and has certainly made this school, and it is a lacuna in my own formation that I've not taught here or studied here, really exemplary, notable, in the front rank, really the leading institution, I think, with respect to environmental policy. I think there are, therefore, in the audience probably future administrators of EPA and leaders of environmental policy in the country, and I would encourage you to think that way. The question that is on the minds of so many students when I talk to classes is, well, how did you do that? How did you get there? And the truth is, I've never been entirely clear, but I think that a preparation for thinking about the whole range of issues that, as Gordon Binder mentioned earlier, are involved with EPA and the intersection of science and health and economics and energy policy is a very good way to prepare for working in fields of public policy generally, and for doing so in a way that leaves you with respect for other disciplines and other interest, which is vitally necessary, as that David Brooks quote indicated, to return this society, particularly in its political discourse, to a more modulated, a more reasonable, I think even a more humane tone. The fact that one senator now representing West Virginia, who's formerly a governor and a good governor, referred to EPA as terrorist, and had in his election materials, videos, a bullseye, and he was photographed shooting at it, and it was the Waxman-Markey climate bill, I think is a very bad sign of rhetoric having gone too far. It's not the first time that that sort of thing has happened. There was a congressman who referred to EPA as a Gestapo on Ruckelshouse's time. I remember Ruckelshaus famously said, "I don't think he meant that as a compliment." But it's going to get heated, and it's necessary, I think, to repair to the kinds of approaches that you have heard some of the giants in the field this morning represent. These are heroes of mine, and I cannot count the number of times that I have looked to one or the other of them and taken their advice, their views. And I remember, say particularly with respect to John Graham, I think I was one of the only people out of the environmental community who supported your confirmation. And
you're lonely.
And I was so delighted to hear Linda Fisher, who was later deputy to Christy Whitman, say that the only person who pays any attention to data in the White House is John Graham. And nice tribute, John, and not a surprise. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own time at EPA and whatever lessons it may have for the future. And I'm going to conclude by reciting Gordon Binder's top 10 achievements of the agency. I received a call, I remember, from Phil Shabakoff, then the New York Times environment correspondent, back in just after the election, maybe 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after, in 1988, in which he said, "Are you aware that you are on a very short list for EPA administrator?" And I said, "Well, I read it in your newspaper." And he said, "But you haven't been contacted?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "That's strange, because this comes from a usually reliable source, but there is something wrong with it." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with it?" "Well, Elizabeth Dole is on that list." And I said, "Why does that make you think something wrong?" "Well, she has political ambition. She would never want to run EPA." and that points to a reality that EPA does not do much for either for a politician or for the political interest of a president. Invariably, it serves regularly to antagonize one interest group or another, and the kind of press and letters that reach the president are typically critical of it. And as for a constituency, the environmental community historically has been small beer, never satisfied, always pushing for more, and as Don Elliott has said, particularly hard on a Republican administration. And when I received the award, a career award from the League of Conservation Voters a few years ago, I reminded them that they had awarded our administration a D after our first year in office. They awarded me personally an A, but the president a D, and this was after the Clean Air Act and a number of other initiatives of that sort. Well, another reporter made a remark to me after my announcement, Guy Darst, who was an AP reporter. He said, "You know, you're going to the best agency." And I said, "Well, that's not really the perception, either in industry or among environmentalists." And he said, "Well, I've covered them all." And he said, "There is no other agency of the government that in the course of a week or two would make 2 or 3 decisions that are right at the center of controversial economics and health impacts and science principles and theories." And he said, "And the other agencies that do it would probably do it maybe once, maybe twice at most in a year, and then they'd screw it up." And I found that true, and feel an enormous respect for the civil servants at the agency for their quality and for their commitment. I remember the Interior Secretary once said to me, he said, "You know," he said, "I give an order in my department, and the Bureau of Mines, they stand up and they salute and they say, 'Yes, sir,' and they carry it out. The Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, want to check with God first." And he said, and then he looked at me, he said, "I forgot who I was talking to. That's all you've got over there is people who check with God first." I said, "Well, Manny, they don't need to." I was reminded by something that was mentioned with respect to cycles, that in the life of agencies there are opportunities for innovation, for creativity, and for breaking new ground and moving in new directions. And there are years of reaction or consolidation and gradual accommodation to the expectations that were built up in a more innovative time. I had the great good fortune to lead the agency during a period of high expectations and opportunity. And that had a lot to do with the fact that we were successful with respect to many of our initiatives. The power in the agency was suggested to me on the day before, I think it was announced by the president that I was going to be the administrator, and I didn't at that time know I was going to be. I guess it was 2 days. I was in Los Angeles and I was meeting with ARCO on behalf of World Wildlife Fund and something that they were funding. Typically those meetings involve 1 at most 2 people. And I remember I was led to a conference room and there were probably 50 or 60 people sitting around the room. And I said to the executive who was hosting me there, what's this about? He said, "The Oil Daily today says it's you." And he said, "People think that we are on pins and needles about the Energy Secretary." He said, "I won't say we're not interested in who the Energy Secretary is going to be. The power, however, fuels, and the rest is all in the EPA." And that is true. And it leads to tremendous responsibility, but as was pointed out by John, opportunity. The first thing I did, really, in fact, even before going to EPA, was to prepare the plan for the Science Advisory Board to consider the priorities of the country. what are the major threats to the health and environment of the United States, both from a health point of view and from an ecological point of view. And they did report in the way that you saw. You saw only the ecology report there. And essentially, if you understood their report, it said to the agency, you're spending about 4/5 of your money on second-order priorities. That is, on hazardous waste, on RCRA, Superfund, and cleanup. One person who was very sensitive to that was Senator Moynihan. And we're all looking for quotes. I was thinking about the quotes that are memorable in my mind. A couple of them come from him. One was, above all, I asked him for his advice, and he had seated me in an 18th century Windsor chair, which he said was quite appropriate to a Republican cabinet officer. And he said to me, above all, don't allow your agency to become transported by middle-class enthusiasms. And he later tried to get me to say that Superfund and RCRA, hazardous waste generally, was a lower order priority. President Bush had run on a platform of really administering and enforcing those laws aggressively. And I took that seriously and did. And we had the strongest enforcement record, more fines set in our period than in the previous 18-year history of the agency. And I didn't bite when he asked me to characterize those issues quite the way our Science Advisory Board had. But I reminded him with respect to risk, and we made risk assessment, risk metrics, the basis for quite a number of our decisions. And that is so badly needed by a regulator, to have a common template that at least the language of which can be understood. And then you're debating application rather than principle. I said a great man once said to me, I agree with you about the need to produce risk, but don't think that you can reduce it to zero. Because remember, life is about risk, and it ends badly. and Moynihan, sitting up on the committee dais, said, no, the great man actually said to you, you live once and then you die. And those interchanges, I marvel at. Their imagination always seemed to come from just the top of his head, but remarkably astute and insightful with respect to policy. I got some advice about my time at EPA that I would mention as one of the signal responsibilities, and I think determinants of effectiveness. My predecessor by, was it 2 or 3? The second administrator, Russell Train, and my mentor, said to me, you're going into a government without any friends. You are not active in the campaign. People are going to look at you and wonder, how did you get this job? You didn't even know the president. And he said, you're going to have 2 things that I would suggest you do, and 2 advantages. One, he said, communicate, work with the press, pay a lot of attention to it. He said, if that works, and for you it will work, he said, people in the White House will end by fearing you, and that is where you want them. Secondly, he said, the president and you are going to get along. You are his kind of guy. And I remember Lee Atwater, the head of the Republican Party, saying to me once over lunch, he said, you know, the president's in politics for people like you. You are the kind of person who are non-political, involved with policy, concerned about getting the right answers, that he really likes and respects. He said, people like me, I'm an instrument. And I don't regret that, or I don't resent it, but it just happens to be true of George Bush. And I remember later thinking about that relationship, and Russell Train said, you know, Reilly sees more of the president in a week than I saw Nixon in a year. And that was probably true. He took me on many of his state visits and invited us to 5 state dinners. Seated my wife next to Prince Philip, and the Queen, dinner for the Queen next to Václav Havel for the dinner for him. And I used to be positioned so that I would cut in on the president on the dance floor after 45 seconds and position my wife so he would then dance with her. And it was, in every way, a very satisfying relationship. And he took me to the 1989 G7 meetings in Paris, where I was able at one point to translate between him and President Mitterrand. This is all by way of saying that I think the first task of leadership in that agency, and it has an administrator now marvelously equipped to do this, is take charge of priority setting. Tell the Congress what the priorities are. I remember my successor commented once when she was asked how did she envision the role of the administrator, and she said, to carry out the will of Congress. And I remember thinking, well, the will of Congress is represented in those 80 committees that Gordon Binder referred to, that we reported to. You have to shape the priorities according to your president's priorities, according to the country's mood and its temperament and what it can afford. And if you do that, and you are noisy enough about it and repeat it often enough, pretty soon you start hearing your message coming back. And those messages were, from my point of view, very important, both to providing direction for the agency itself and a unifying message so that people understood they were working to a common plan, but also for the country, because the country doesn't know how to think about environmental issues. You have only to look at attitudes toward climate change to understand that. And even when they seem to, for example, in the state of California, where we have quite a good, strong climate law presently, I just completed a chairmanship of a commission on task force on adaptation for Governor Schwarzenegger. And although it is commonly accepted that California is headed for significant climate change, those who make infrastructure decisions, state and local officials, planning and zoning officials, pay very little attention to what the implications of those changes are expected to be and how they will affect those infrastructure decisions. So that is the sort of thing, I think, on which we do need communication, we do need leadership, we do need science. And I would say that if anything I wanted my agency to be remembered for, and starting with that priorities review by the Science Advisory Board, it was for trying to base the decisions that we made on good science. It is the secular religion of our country. There is no other better unifying principle around which to organize policy and to deploy resources. And I think one should constantly refer to it. And I am of the opinion that ultimately data is heard and does get accepted. And with respect to climate change, those 11 National Academies of Science that have opined that humans are having an impact on the climate, when the crisis comes, all of a sudden, the analyses they have prepared and done, I think, will be taken much more seriously. And on the Milton Friedman quote that we heard this morning, I'm reminded that the clean air staff at EPA throughout the 1980s did the research, conducted the examinations, carried out the reviews that were the basis for the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. There was very little chance that in the 1980s any of that would have come to fruition. But it did not deter the staff at EPA from preparing for the day when they could, and they would. And they did. Secondly, after the scientific principle that should govern so much, I would say recognize the international dimensions of the issues that we address. I am so reminded, even in the Gulf now, that we cannot manage and protect the Gulf of Mexico without assistance from Mexico and Cuba, both of which intend to go into deep water within the next 2 years. We can't manage the Arctic without the agreements of the Russians and the Canadians and the Danes who've already begun to drill in Greenland. That is something that I gave a very high priority to, and I look back at the kinds of things that I did, and that the President really appreciated that I did. And if you were working for an internationalist president, it really was very useful to have established a very good relationship with Helmut Kohl and Margaret Thatcher. And I don't know if you ever knew that I also went to see the Pope, but I did. Those relationships, and I'll never forget some of them. Helmut Kohl in particular, after the 1989 summit, while we were walking down the corridors of the Louvre, he asked the president, how do I follow up on this summit on the environment? And the president said, see Reilly. And he turned to me and he said in German, ich brauche Ihre Karte, which means I need your card. And I remember thinking for a moment, well, I had a card, but this German chancellor couldn't be asking me for my card. And at any rate, we set up a meeting and I went to see him, and our ambassador, Vernon Walters, said, that is Rhenish for I need your help. I'll never forget the close of that meeting with Helmut Kohl, which I reminded him of last fall in Germany when I was invited to go to the dinner for the Gorbachev, Bush, and Kohl on the anniversary of the wall coming down. He said, on your country and on mine, rest whatever hope there is in this world to address the most serious planetary threat. And on your shoulders weighs the need to bring your president to understand and to lead on that issue. And it still gives me a chill to remember that. We have in the United States the capacity to lead internationally. And I recall how the forestry convention, or was to be a forestry convention, which Jonathan mentioned and worked on, came to be. And this is in the realm of politics, but this is actually the story. Helmut Kohl and the Germans were making a great thing about the need for targets and timetables in the Convention on Climate Change. And the summit was going to address those, the G7, then G7 summit in Houston, of all places, President's home ground, and that was really not going to go over with the White House, and it wasn't going to do the environment much good to have that Donnybrook occur. And so I called the German Environment Minister, Klaus Tepfer, and said, and proposed a deal. And the deal I proposed was a forestry convention and a backing off of targets and timetables, which the United States was just not prepared to agree to yet. And I never forget, he said, well, the Chancellor cares about climate. He's nuts about trees. I think he'll take the deal. Well, he did take the deal. And that suggests something else about EPA. I went up, in the 5th week I was in office, I made a decision to cancel a dam, to start the veto process against the Two Forks Dam, a $500 million dam in Colorado, in which there was no federal money involved. And I thought I could then take some time off. It was Good Friday, as I recall. I had previously talked to Senator Chafee, the ranking Republican on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and said, just hypothetically, if I were to use the Clean Water Act in a very aggressive way, would the Congress react? Would they remove any authority in that law? And he said, no. He said, you're riding high now and it's early in the administration. But my only advice to you is, I don't need to know what you're planning to do, but whatever it is, if it's controversial, do it when we're out of town. So I did it on Good Friday, and then Gordon Binder walked in my office probably 15 minutes later and said, there's been a spill in Alaska. It looks like it's a big one. And I called up the Chief of Staff, John Sununu, at the White House that afternoon and told him I was going to Alaska. Now, I had no jurisdiction in Alaska. EPA had no jurisdiction. And yet I became the spokesperson on that issue and was a much more credible and plausible one than the Transportation Secretary, say, would have been, because I was the green conscience, as it used to be said. We took those opportunities to make the point that we were, to the extent the country had one, the signal and undivided environment agency in the United States. And I think that is a very important way to define the agency, to keep the big picture in mind, and to communicate in a big picture way. It is rare that you will have a president who is a small picture guy with respect to the environment, and neither is most of the country and most of the members of Congress. So one constantly needs to remind what it is we're doing, what really the cause is, and how important it is to succeed at it. The third thing I will say is how important it is to craft regulations that, in Michael Porter of Harvard Business School's term, are smart regulations, that are performance-oriented, for example, that foster technological innovation and do not inhibit it. It is possible to do either with regulations. And this is something that has been on my mind a lot in looking at the prescriptive regulations that are the obvious and logical tendency at the Interior Department after the oil spill. One has to be careful not to have regulations that are applicable and effective today, but in 3 to 5 years, regulating a very dynamic industry, become anachronistic. There are ways to do that, and I think the Clean Air Act, the pollution rights trading, the market-based approaches are effective at that. Part of the leadership, though, goes beyond regulation, and I think a large part of it. And I was reminded of this a couple of years ago in China when I was invited to come and help design a new environmental agency in China. And I gave the nuts and bolts of our system, of how it works, and of ambient standards and all the rest. And the group to whom I was speaking looked perplexed. And they began to ask questions. And the first question I got was, how did you, when you were at EPA in Washington, get the states to pay any attention to you? They don't pay any attention to us at all in Beijing. And I said, well, we could, under certain circumstances, cut off their highway money, or some of their infrastructure money. Do you have that resource? Well, not really. We had a very aggressive non-governmental organization community. What else you got? We had the courts. No. And then we had the press. I was kind of out of gas. And a young Chinese woman who was working for World Wildlife Fund stood up and said, Mr. Reilly, you did not mention your voluntary programs. Would you describe those? And she knew them in detail. 3350 and Energy Star and some of the others that Gordon Binder described this morning. And all of the people in the group, who were the people who were going to actually write the law for China, began writing furiously. And the question then I got was, what did you give those companies, for example, that did what you asked them to do about reducing toxic emissions 33% and then 50%? And I said, well, I gave them a flag to fly over their plant and a nice letter from me. And I was amused or bemused in saying that. To my astonishment, people began to say that could work. The Chinese do now have a 1,000 company approach to pollution. I think they're going to increase it to 10,000, where they're proceeding company by company to ask that reductions be made in CO2, SO2, and so forth. So it's very important to recognize that some of these things can be done which have consequences for policy and for activities, not just in your own country, although they did, I think, in this country, but in the rest of the world as well. And that very often they are things, and I look now at so many of the companies that I've had experience with and see they are so far ahead of the Congress in their expectation of the need to reduce their carbon footprint. And they want to act, and they want to be seen to act. And there are so many reasons for that have to do with resources and waste and cost and image and all of those things. That gives them an opportunity to display what they can do. It also serves to the legislature to make clear these things can be done. On the international front, I think about some of our initiatives. One time, Secretary Baker, after Tiananmen Square, none of us at our level in government were allowed to go to China. And so I did not get there in my time at EPA, but met with the Chinese minister at ozone conferences and such other places, various other places. And I remember Secretary Baker saying to me, I don't know what you're doing with the Chinese, and I don't need to know, but he said, they love you. Keep it up. And I said, well, what we're doing is helping them with methane reduction and cement kiln dust suppression and CFC alternatives and replacements. And we got DuPont to send some engineers to explain to them why they did not need to have CFCs in the 300 million refrigerators that were planned for the next 10-year production cycle in China. A decision that would have blown away virtually everything relative to appliances in the West had they proceeded with it, and they didn't. So the fact that the agency had that credibility, and by the way, I don't think I ever had any money for things international. We basically stole it from the water program, the air program, or somewhere else. And it has always been resisted on the part of the Congress and OMB that EPA get funds for any significant international outlays. I recall my predecessor, Russell Train, once giving testimony, and he was an internationalist before Jamie Whitten, who was the renowned and feared, I see somebody remembers him, renowned and feared chairman of the House Appropriations Committee from Mississippi. And Mr. Whitten said, "Now, Administrator, this international stuff and all this travel, I just don't see it. Now, this Tbilisi, what's that all about?" And Train said, "Well, that's in Georgia, sir." "Oh, well, that's all right." That emphasis on the international dimension is so crucial. And it's crucial, I think, not just to an internationalist president, but after a couple of years, in my experience, all presidents become internationalists because it's such a relief to go abroad and travel in the motorcade and meet with foreign ministers and and heads of state and be taken seriously and be respected, as opposed to going up to Congress and fighting for things. And I imagine that that's true of President Obama now, as it has been true of others. I will give Gordon's top 10 now, with which I essentially agree. I think I get 4 or 5 of them, so how could I not in the 40-year history of EPA? And the first, well, he starts with number 10, the Nafta environmental side agreements. These were truly path-breaking. I don't think from an environmental point of view they may have received the kind of attention they deserved, but to insert environmental priorities into a trade agreement had never been done. To make in the preamble that one of the objectives was to foster sustainable development and the upward ratcheting of environmental standards among the 3 countries, and a whole range of such things. And I remember I was one of 3 Republicans, Carla Hills and Colin Powell, invited to the signing of Nafta by Bill Clinton, who recited those in introducing me. And very much impressed me that he did understand the significance of that. Someone who didn't was the European Union Commissioner for Competitiveness, whose name was Van Meert, who said to me, "You have inserted," I went to see him after our election, and so we were lame ducks. I didn't really have much staying power. But I said we should put in the WTO these very same principles. And he said, "You have introduced concepts utterly foreign to trade. And it is very destructive what you have done. It is going to be distracting from the principal purpose of trade agreements." And those views are held, or were then, by distinguished trade officials. And these concepts were in fact foreign, but I think path-breaking. And I later did a poll to find out whether any other environment minister had ever testified on a trade treaty. Not one had. And I had testified 7 times and been given control over 2 of the 7 chapters of Nafta, which Linda Fisher and Dan Esty were key to designing the environmental and pharmacological parts. So these things, I think, so that certainly qualifies, in my mind, given the importance of trade and the signal importance of doing what we have not successfully done in the United States, of integrating our environmental aspirations with our economic priorities. And to the extent that that has been done in the NAFTA agreement, I think should serve as a precedent. 9, he cites our significant accomplishments with respect to things international. I just will comment on the creation of the Budapest Center for the Environment of Central and Eastern Europe, which was our idea. I presented it to our cabinet. It was very much something that the the Czechs wanted to do. And I remember being very moved at the opening to see all of these prime ministers and ministers who had only recently gotten out of jail. And I found myself saying that it was, we had in common that our public officials also often do time in jail, but it's usually after their term of service rather than the way you've done it before. And that center is still going. You may remember that Central and Eastern Europe was a mess after the wall came down, and that cleanup task proved very significant, and EPA played a critical role in guiding the World Bank to how to address those problems. 8 on Gordon's list is engage the environmental justice issue. And we did create an environmental justice office and engaged that in a very serious way, particularly with respect to native tribes in New Mexico. And I remember visiting some of the 12 pueblos and deciding that they did in fact have sufficient intellectual and professional capacity to assume responsibility of a state, as was provided for in the Clean Water Act. This was an enormously controversial decision at the time, and one who defended it, not the only one as I recall, was John McCain, who was ranking on the Indian Affairs Committee, and met with me and said the same thing outside in his press conference as he had said to me inside, which is not always the way it works. But the environmental justice movement, and in trying to act on it, is subtle and complex. We were quite aggressive at regulating those largely unregulated sources in cities of air pollution, such as large bakeries, auto body shops, places where painting was done. And I received a delegation of mayors and some minority leaders who said, "You are stomping on sources of employment for our unskilled population in areas of our cities that are plagued by high unemployment. This is really not welcome." Those are the kinds of things you hear in private if you're the EPA administrator, but they're not said publicly. Essentially, the message was lighten up. I received a similar message once from Senator Gregg with respect to hazardous waste. He said, "I know as a federal judge you do in fact have the authority to make the city of Durham spend," I think, is it Durham, New Hampshire? Yeah, spend more on its waste cleanup than on its school system. But believe me, if I were a federal judge, I would find a way not to enforce your decisions. To which my answer was, the municipal waste is composed of something like 4% hazardous waste. I promise to administer this law and enforce it until you all screamed. EPA did not support this law, and but I'm certainly pledged to carry it out. And I think the reaction, particularly among the Northeast senators, led later to a more reasonable accommodation of the kinds of cleanup standards that were necessary and that Carol Browner followed through and put into effect. But some of those issues are very worthy of attention. They often are challenges to research and epidemiological studies, and I think they are real, and they deserve attention, and so therefore it's on this list. Emergency removal actions, some 1,700 of them, which are very important to communities all across the country, and not important to just one matter, important to things like the value of people's homes, the willingness of people to live in a place, the sense of safety that they feel with respect to their children and bringing them up there and allowing them to play. Some very basic expectations the public has and that EPA has quietly, typically, carried out. So often with men in hazmat suits while children played on tricycles nearby asking, "What are you doing?" End to ocean dumping. This is something of sewage sludge. This is something that has often struck me as an unmet priority in the country. We have not had national priority for the oceans. We've done so well with respect to the environmental priorities the country has set. We never set one for the oceans. President Obama did something that delighted me from several perspectives when he declared a new national policy on the oceans some months ago. And he committed to marine spatial planning, which has been a forte of the Institute and the school. And I understand a report is coming out on here. And it delighted me as co-chairman of the Oil Spill Commission, and I recounted the story to my fellow commissioners, saying, look, this was a proposal of two quite substantial and effective, at least from the point of view of their recommendations, oceans commissions that are 4 years old. They didn't go anywhere. And then all of a sudden, the president and the administration picked up marine spatial planning. And I think we need more attention to the oceans, perhaps with the result that we saw last April of one exploitation, one use of the oceans to the detriment of so many others. We will get it in the future. Number 5 is passive smoke and side stream smoke. And I remember this was a very controversial decision within the administration. I received 2 warnings from the White House not to go there, and I was able to say each time without much effect, I don't think you want me to have to say when I'm deposed, as inevitably I will be, that you made this call. And I was told that I was possibly going to put 5 states at risk. And I recounted the way in which this decision was moving forward and how it had been very carefully designed with respect to its timetable to come to me for a decision sometime between the 1st of December and the 1st of January. And we had a controversy over the confidence interval, a 90% confidence interval, which the tobacco industry made a great deal of, rather than the usual 95. The fact was we couldn't find people who didn't have evidence of tobacco in their lungs and in their blood. I think we finally found some nuns in New Mexico, some hermetic nuns. I won't dwell on that. I see I'm going on here. Some good stories, though. I discovered from a friend that who went to work for Philip Morris in Brussels that they spent the first 2 weeks understanding or being made to understand why this was a really dumb decision. But it did precipitate action, I think, around the country on smoking, and a lot of very grateful people in bars who worked in bars and restaurants, and people who worked in the airplanes, that they no longer were victimized by the smoke, irrespective of whether they wished to. And I remember I invited Lou Sullivan, the health secretary, over to my press conference announcing that decision, and we were asked whether tobacco should be contraband, basically whether it should be forbidden. And I remember quickly answering that question lest Lou give his real views, which is he thought it should. But I said, and I think people take risks in America. We jump out of airplanes and ride motorcycles and do other things that as part of being an American and being free. And smoking is one of those things. And I don't for a minute think that it ought to be forbidden. But I don't think people ought to have to submit to its effects who do so as a matter of job necessity if they don't wish to. And that is, I think, the law increasingly in many of our states and cities. Water treatment has been mentioned. It's number 4. Obviously, water treatment is so fundamental to the history of the country. I remember reading so many years ago that of all of the health improving decisions that have been made in the 20th century, penicillin and the rest, nothing compares to sanitation. Water treatment is basic, is vital, and has been effectively done. I do believe that we need to revisit the Clean Water Act and adapt it to the areas that it's not working in, particularly with respect to non-point sources and to sensitive areas. And the area of the Gulf that is dead for much of the year ought to be uppermost in our minds for that. Incidentally, there are people in Iowa farmers I discover, who are very sensitive to that and are trying to reduce the nitrates that they are using in order to protect the Gulf. I just discovered that really last summer at a meeting among farmers in Iowa. On that issue, I did propose to have a new Clean Water Act and to propose one after the Clean Air Act had passed. And Senator Chafee discouraged me. He said, if you even bring that up here, given your aggressive use of 404, the veto authority, he said, I think you may lose powers that you have. It's just not the time. So we didn't do that. But it still needs to be done. The ban on DDT was a path-breaking decision because it recognized the natural environment as opposed to a pure health concern. I don't think, to my knowledge, that DDT has much impact on the health of humans, but it certainly does on the strength of eggshells of birds. And so that was an important decision, and I very much considered that my Two Forks veto was in that tradition, an ecological decision, basically, ecology protecting decision, and that would be my number 2 on this list. That was a decision that caused Neil Bush to attack me in Colorado, and President Son, and Lee Atwater also, the chairman of the Republican Party. And I went over to see Atwater, and he was standing up against his bookcase with his hands up, and he said, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. Well, he said, I'm not really innocent, but I'm going to be innocent. He said, look, you've made people in Colorado, our people, so mad with that decision, but the press, the letters to the White House are running 9-1 in your favor. There are a lot of fishermen in this country. A lot of my friends in the National Wildlife Federation had a lot to do with those letters. But he said, unless I see you putting a Senate seat at risk, I'm going to stay out of your way. He even said at one point that he was going to help me. And Lee Atwater was based purely on politics and political advancement. That was his responsibility. And he said, would you like to know why I'm going to help you? And he said, because this president, to a very uncommon degree, owes his election to one constituency. And it's a constituency to which your issue appeals greatly. It's at least the number 2 issue. It's in the top 2, and it's suburban women. And he said, to the extent that you have opportunities to spend time in certain states and with certain groups that foster that reputation that you have and you're getting for us, he said, I will help you a lot. And he did, as long as he was healthy, irrespective of the Two Forks veto, which he didn't like much. And finally, the Clean Air Act amendments. I think probably a great deal has been said about the Clean Air Act amendments and the pollution rights trading that they involved. But I think this was up on someone's slide today, but the degree to which these have contributed to genuine measurable improvements in the environment and health of the people of the United States. Particulates are down by nearly 1/3, lead by more than 3/4, nitrogen oxide by more than 1/3, sulfur dioxide measured annually by nearly 60%, ozone, the 8-hour standard, by 14%. Obviously, the lead in gasoline, that probably should have made the list. A reduction that took place in the late 70s. A reduction of a removal of lead in gasoline was one of those signal decisions that contributed so much to protecting particularly the most vulnerable children who are susceptible to lead pollution, and that affects IQ and brain development and all of that. When you think about some of those things, you have to acknowledge that the agency that has been responsible for implementing so many of these rules has touched the lives, the health, the well-being, and the expectations so intimately of so many people in such a positive way, which has made me very, very proud to be part of it, and very proud to participate with you in the celebration of its 40th anniversary. Thank you.